What are tag-along rights? How do they work? And should you include them in your document? I'm Malcolm Zoppi, an English qualified solicitor. In this video, we will discuss tag-along rights. We will also go over the differences between tag-along and drag-along provisions, as well as discuss the advantages and disadvantages of using tag-along provisions in your documents. Fantastic, let's get started. So chapter 1 is, what are tag-along rights? In short, tag-along rights are contractual provisions that aim to protect minority shareholders when majority shareholders have been offered to sell their shares to a third-party buyer. The way these provisions work is that minority shareholders can tag along and request that the buyer also offer to buy their shares on the same terms as the majority shareholders. Effectively, they would like to tag along and also sell their shares to that buyer. Then, if the buyer is unwilling to do so, then the majority shareholders are prohibited from selling their shares to that buyer. Fantastic. Let's move on to chapter 2, tag-along versus drag-along. What are the key differences? So we've discussed tag-along provisions. Now let's define drag-along rights. In short, drag-along provisions enable majority shareholders to force minority shareholders to also sell their shares to a third-party buyer. So as opposed to tag-along provisions, which are exercised by minority shareholders and they can tag along and, if they want, also sell their shares to a buyer, drag-along provisions are exercised by majority shareholders and they force minority shareholders to sell their shares to that buyer. Okay, so let's run through the key 3 differences between tag-along and drag-along provisions. The first is that tag-along rights benefit minority shareholders, whilst drag-along rights benefit majority shareholders. Secondly, tag-along rights give the option to minority shareholders to sell their share to a buyer, whilst drag-along rights or provisions force minority shareholders to sell their shares to that buyer. And lastly, tag-along rights exist to avoid the minority shareholders being left behind and having a stranger as a new majority shareholder, whilst drag-along rights exist to not jeopardize a potential business sale. And this is because typically a buyer of a business usually wants to buy all of the shares of the company, not just those of the majority shareholder. Now, before we discuss the advantages and disadvantages of tag-along rights, feel free to email me if looking for professional legal advice. With our legal advice calls, there are no charges, no obligations, and no nonsense. Contact me now at info@zoppi.co.uk. Fantastic. Let's move on to chapter 3, which is the advantages and disadvantages of tag-along provisions. Fantastic. Let's start with the advantages. Well, first, minority shareholders are not left behind with a stranger as a new majority shareholder. So that's a big one. The second very big advantage of tag-along rights for minority shareholders is that they're more likely to be able to exit their investment and sell their shares to a buyer. And lastly, the company itself typically would have an easier time attracting equity investors if they include tag-along provisions in their documents. But of course, there are going to be disadvantages. The first is it adds complexity and compliance costs because typically certain procedures need to be followed and these are usually carried out by solicitors who would charge money. Secondly, these provisions might jeopardize a majority shareholder's sale of their shares if, for example, that buyer doesn't want to buy the shares from that minority shareholder. If the buyer only wants the majority shareholder's shares and the only way they can get them if they also buy the shares of the minority shareholder via these tag-along provisions, then they might just step away and say, I'm not buying any shares in this case. And of course, this is the big disadvantage for majority shareholders. And lastly, it may lower the price per share that a buyer of a business is willing to pay because the total purchase price for that business needs to be shared amongst both minority and majority shareholders. So that's how tag-along rights work in practice and the main advantages and disadvantages of using them. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. I promise I will answer any questions that you may have. And if you want to learn more about drag-along provisions, the sister or brother to tag-along provisions, make sure to watch this video right here. Thank you for watching.